Today we continue in our sermon series entitled, God Has His Ways. Have you lived long enough to know that God has His ways? Have you been in a situation where you thought there was no way you were going to get through this? You probably thought, this is it, I'm done, I'm doomed, it's over, and you wondered how could God come through? And a few days, weeks, maybe moments later, you discover that God has His ways. He doesn't need to consult us for the things He does. He doesn't need to check in and get our approval. He can do what He wants to do on our behalf, and He has a million ways to do it, possibly more. Let's look at one of those ways. We're going to read some scripture in here. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn it on and click to Exodus. Now we want to read chapter 5, but we got to back up a little bit to chapter 4. We're going to begin at verse 29, Exodus. We're going to start in chapter 4, verse 29. And the text says, Then Moses, let me give you a little background. God had just met with Moses at the burning bush. Everybody recalls the burning bush story. Moses was shepherding his sheep, and he saw a bush on fire, and it started to talk, and God told him, hey, I'm God, I'm Yahweh. I'm going to send you down to Egypt. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go. That's the backstory. Now let's get into the text. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which Yahweh had spoken to Moses. Then he did the signs in the sight of the people. So the people believed. And when they heard that Yahweh had visited the children of Israel and that He had looked on their afflictions, then they bowed their heads and worshiped. Afterwards, that's chapter 5. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, Thus says Yahweh, God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, Who is Yahweh that I should obey His voice to let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, nor will I let Israel go. So they said, The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to Yahweh our God, lest He fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Then the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Go back to your labor. And Pharaoh said, Look, the people of the land are many now, and you make them rest from their labor. So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, You shall no longer give the people straw to make brick as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, and you shall lay on them the quota of bricks which they made before. You shall not reduce it, for they're idle. Therefore they cry out, saying, Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let more work be laid on them, that they may labor in it, and let them not regard false words. And the taskmasters of the people and their officers went out and spoke to the people, saying, Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go get yourselves straw where you can find it. Yet none of your work will be reduced. So the people were scattered abroad throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble instead of straw. And the taskmasters forced them to hurry, saying, Fulfill your work, your daily quota, as when there was straw. Also the officers of the children of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and were asked, Why have you not fulfilled your task in making the brick, both yesterday and today as before? Then the officers of the children of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, saying, Why are you dealing why are you dealing thus with your servants? There is no straw given to your servants, and they say to us, Make brick. And indeed, your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people. But he said, You're idle. Therefore you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Therefore go now, work, for no straw shall be given you, yet you shall deliver the quota of bricks. And the officers of the children of Israel saw that they were in trouble after it was said, you shall not reduce any bricks from your daily quota. Then as they came out from Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron, who stood to meet them. And they said to them, let the Lord, let Yahweh look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. So Moses returned to Yahweh and said to him, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all. Imagine finally having the hope of being freed. Imagine yourself under a burden all of your life. Imagine freedom just being an idea you heard about, something you saw for other people but never experienced it for yourself. Imagine a life of oppression, and for the first time you dream that life of freedom could be yours as well. To think for the first time your eyes have a glimmer, have a shine. For the first time you have hope. For the first time there's a pep in your step. For the first time there's a song in your heart. And not a song of a dirge, not a song of grieving, but a song of hope. And you anticipate that good things are going to happen. Why? Because a man of God has come into your life. And he has said that God has heard your cries. And he's calling for you to come out. Imagine all of that. And instead of getting what you expect, you get beat. Instead of getting freedom, you get more oppression. Instead of experiencing happiness, you experience more misery. Because you had hope, you find yourself suffering more than before. Imagine how difficult it was for the children of Israel. They had the opportunity to see Aaron and Moses perform the signs that God had shared with them in the desert. They saw the staff turn into a serpent. They saw what the power of God could do. So they had every reason to believe that good things were going to happen to them. But it didn't. Instead, the work got worse. The violence got worse. The abuse became worse. Instead of being free, they were further oppressed. What would that be like if it happened to you? I don't know what your Christian experience has been. But if you've been a Christian for a while, perhaps you have discovered the reality that when God is at work, sometimes things get worse before they get better. When God is working for you, when God is working around you, sometimes things get worse before they get better. You may hope for deliverance, but you find more oppressions. You may hope for that relationship that will meet all your needs, and you find yourself even more alone and rejected than you were before. My friends, when we're following God's plans, let's not be surprised when things get worse. When we're following God's leads, let's not be all horrified when we discover there is opposition to God's plan for our lives. And that is the stuff of this earth. See, God uses the very things we seek to avoid to bring about the things we need. God uses the very things we seek to avoid to bring about the things we need. And you ask yourself, why is this? Why can't it just be easy? Why do I have to go through this? Well, there's a reality about life. It's not just about your Christian life. It's about life in general. And that reality is that victory comes from struggling. Victory comes from struggling. You don't get what you want just by wishing for it. You don't get what you want just by naming and claiming it. There is a struggle involved in getting to that desired future. My friends, your struggles may catch you by surprise, but God knows your struggles before he leads you down the road. See, when God spoke to Moses back at the burning bush and told him, go down and tell Pharaoh to let my people go, right there in Exodus 3:19, God said to Moses, I am sure the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not even by a mighty hand. In other words, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And by the way, he's not going to let him go. That's how this is going to work out. And he goes on to say, so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst. And after that, he will let you go. What's he saying? Go ahead, take this hope, take this promise of freedom, tell my people that freedom is coming, and Pharaoh's not going to let you go. But we're going to have a tizzy. We're going to have a struggle. We're going to have a showdown. And when I'm done with him, he's going to let you go. I believe God knew and God knows what Frederick Douglass expressed in one of his many writings and speeches. He says, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. God knew that. God knew that. Therefore, God sent Moses to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Make the demand, because power concedes nothing without the demand. You've got to state what you want, make the demand. And after the demand comes the struggle. See, my friends, freedom requires moral struggle. Equality requires political struggles. Your cushy job requires academic struggles. Your beautiful house requires construction struggles. Your healthy retirement requires your long-term investment struggles. And even the joy of having children require the struggle of labor. Our eternal salvation requires a struggle. And Jesus was explaining that to his disciples right before the cross. As he spoke to them probably the night before his arrest, if not the same night, he explained to them, I'm going to be with you for a while, but then you're not going to see me for a bit. And they had their minds all twisted up. Go to John 16 with me, if you would, please. And pick up at verse 19. He says, now Jesus knew that they would desire to ask him, and he said to them, are you inquiring among yourselves about what I said? A little while, and you will not see me. In a little while, and you will see me. Let me try to not scroll while I'm reading. Most assuredly, he said, I say to you that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice and you will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will be turned to joy. A woman, when she is in labor, has sorrow because her hour has come, but as soon as she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. How many of you can attest to that? I recall at the birth of my firstborn, we were young, and my wife was experiencing the pains, and she was saying, I can't do this again. And it was getting rough. Mind you, she had one of the quickest deliveries in the world. I am told, I haven't been there and I never will, thank God, but I'm told those rapid deliveries, a woman doesn't have the opportunity to adjust to the different pain thresholds. So she went from 0 to 60 fast. In 3 hours, we went into we arrived at 7 and the child was out at 10. So that was a quick labor, but it was a very painful labor. And in the midst, she says, I will never do this again. But about 5, 10, 15 minutes into holding the baby, she says, I think we could do this again. Yes, my friends, there's a struggle, and in that struggle we think we're not going to make it. In that struggle we think it's all over. In that struggle we wonder if we have what it takes. But every victory requires a struggle. Your victory requires a struggle. Your success requires a struggle. Your achievement requires a struggle. Your freedom requires a struggle. Your fulfillment requires a struggle. I don't know about you, but sometimes my biggest struggle is the struggle to not struggle. Did that make sense to you? See, sometimes the biggest struggle is within my head. To not jump ahead of things, to not take on the struggle that is not yet arrived. Much of anxiety, much of depression, much of our mental illness is a matter of struggling with things that haven't even happened yet. Sometimes our biggest struggle is within ourselves. Let me ask you something. I know how many of you swim. I would hope some of you swim. I won't say I'm lifeguard quality, but I can get out of the deep end of the pool safely most of the time. But have you ever seen someone, usually an adult, I think adults are worse at this than children, but have you ever seen someone learning to float? It's a struggle, isn't it? You tell them lay down and you try to hold them up, and as soon as you let go, they start thrashing all over the place. It's a struggle not to struggle when you're trying to learn to float. Until you figure it out, floating becomes a struggle. Here's the catch, my friends. Here's the good news. As people of God, we don't have to struggle alone. As people of God, we do not have to struggle alone. When we're obedient to God, He struggles for us. When we follow His lead, we don't struggle alone. When we're with Him, we see it, but we don't have to bear it all. Let God take your struggles. Don't fight, don't flay, don't struggle when you don't have to. God will fight your battles. God will struggle for you. And the story, the book of the Bible, the stories in the Bible are all about how God fights for us, how God redeems us, how God saves us, how God takes care of us. If we want to get through our struggles, if we want to have victory in our struggles, we need to let God fight for us. And you say, well, how is He going to do that? How does God fight for us? Well, first of all, God fights for us as in on our behalf. God will take on fights on our behalf. Back to Exodus 3 real quickly. God had said to Moses that Pharaoh's not going to let you go, but what does He say right after that? I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst. After that, He will let you go. What's God saying? I am going to fight this one. I've got this one. You don't have to do anything here. Just follow my lead because I will fight for you. God sent plague after plague after plague to strike Egypt, from frogs to flies to hail to darkness to the death of animals, even to the death of the firstborns. God struck Egypt time and time again. God fights for us. Even as the children of Israel were leaving, they had made their escape. The Egyptians told them to go, get out of here. And then as they're by the Red Sea and the sea opens, they turn around and it seems the Egyptians changed their minds. And now they're coming after them, and the children of Israel are afraid as they walk across the Dead Sea, and eventually the Egyptians make it into the sea and begin to chase them. What does God do? Before he closes the sea back, there was something happening. Exodus 14, it tells us that when this happened, God took, according to this verse, God took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. What's that about? Even as we think we're at the point of death, even as we think it's all over, God is still fighting for us. In many of the battles that Israel fought, more were killed by the hand of God than by the sword of the Israelites. Either through hail or through storms or whatever, God is fighting for us. When Pharaoh's army got too close, God got their chariot wheels stuck in mud or unpinned the spokes on their wheels. God fights for us. God has an arsenal of weapons to fight that our opposition is completely oblivious to. You realize God will manipulate creation in his battle for us? Have you seen God cause rain when you need it rain? There are times that God changes the natural order of things just so he can fight our battles. Henry Blackaby, who wrote the workbook and eventually the textbook called Experiencing God, he tells of a struggle they had. Now, Blackaby, a Baptist pastor from the United States serving in Canada, they had a situation where their church they needed money for their building fund. They needed to close on a building. And they were about $100,000 and change short, and they did not know when it was going to come. And he said at some point he got information that there was an agency in the United States that was going to send them several $1,000s, but it still left them about, if I recall correctly, if my numbers are off, it's okay, the point still remains, but I think they were off about $20,000 from that. Well, the money delayed in coming, and they wondered what was God doing, because the money kept delaying in coming. During that time, during the delay, there were some fluctuations in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Canadian dollar. At the time that the money landed, the Canadian dollar had dropped enough so that the amount sent from the United States when transferred to Canadian currency had increased by the $20,000 additional dollars they needed. My friends, God will manipulate systems. God will manipulate creation. God will manipulate things around you in his battle for you. So first thing we need to know is God fights for us. But we also need to be aware that God fights ahead of us. He not only fights for us, he fights ahead of us. You know, I was going through my Bible reading some time ago, and I'll be there shortly again. And there were two verses in the Old Testament, one's in Exodus, one's in Joshua, that caught my attention. God in Exodus is telling his people what he will do for them. Take a look at Exodus 23, verse 28. Exodus 23, 28. God is speaking. He says, and I will send hornets before you which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you. Now, some time ago, I made reference to this verse, and I talked about how I was on my lawnmower, and I had run over a hornet's nest, and suddenly, within 2 seconds, I had been stung 5 times, and immediately I jumped off and ran and decided I was done mowing for the day. That was my experience with hornets. So, after that, these verses catch my attention, right? So God says, I will send hornets before you. Now you go to Joshua chapter 24, verse 12, and there God is speaking again, and he says, I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out from before you, also the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with your sword or with your bow. Why am I looking at these 2 verses? God says, I will send hornets. He says that to Moses. And when Joshua comes around, God says, I sent the hornet. Now, of all the battles that we read of the children of Israel, I am looking for the one with the hornets. It's not there. There is not a battle recorded that says, and God sent the hornets, and the hornets drove them out. Why is that? Sometimes God is so far out ahead of us, we forget that he's even out there. Sometimes God is taking care of our battles so well that we just cruise into a situation and have no idea how much work God did before we got there. Now, they wrote down the battles they were involved with, right? The Israelites kept a record of the various battles that they engaged and how God came through, but they did not write about the battle with the hornets because they had nothing to do with it. In fact, they may not even have appreciated how God had fought that battle for them. God said he would, God said he did. Children of Israel were completely oblivious to the fact that God did it. How many of God's miracles are taking place in our lives and we're completely oblivious? God protects us on the road and we're completely oblivious. God keeps us from sudden death and we're completely oblivious. God keeps harm from coming to us. God gives us favor on the job. Sometimes we think it was just our good work ethic. My friends, there are times that God fights ahead of us. And we're completely oblivious of the fact that God is doing it. So God fights for us. God fights ahead of us. Here's the one we probably don't really want to know. God fights through us. Yes, God fights through us. There are many times God engages us in the battle. Yet, my friend, remember that it's not our battle. There are times that God does not extinguish the flames. There are times that God does not remove the lions. But God takes us through these experiences. Last week we looked at Exodus 17. Let's go back there. Exodus 17, the Amalekites come out and attack the Israelites. After God said he would not take them through the land of the Philistines because they weren't to see war. And the point we made with this last week is that God filters our trials, right? This week I want to make the point that God fights through us. Chapter 17, verse 8 says, Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim, and Moses said to Joshua, Choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. I think we know how that story ends, but just in case, as Moses is on the top of the hill with his 2 helpers, as long as his hands are up, rod in his hand, the Israelites are winning. If his hands get tired and they start coming down, the Amalekites start winning. So eventually, a large stone is found. Moses sits on the stone. Aaron and Hur hold up his hands until Israel completely wins. Here's the thing. God fights through us. There is no battle that God sends us into. There is no battle that God leads us into that we will not win. God does not send us into battle to become victims. He does not send us into trials to lose. He does not send us into predicaments so that we fail. He sends us in to win if only we would let him fight through us. How do you let God fight through you? Well, you do exactly what God tells you to do. That's how you let God fight through you. If he says go with the sword, you go with the sword. If he says go with a pitcher of water, you go with a pitcher. If he says go with the choir, you go with the choir. You do it the way God says it, and he will fight through. Some of us are a little averse to conflict. Some of us would rather apologize for somebody else's wrongdoing rather than address them on their wrongdoing. So when we're put in predicaments where God needs to fight through us, we're more likely to back out of that fight. But that fight is not going to be won unless God fights through us. Which means when those situations come up, whether you like conflict or not, you've got to be there. Whether you feel intimidated or not, whether the odds are stacked against you or not, whether it looks hopeless or not, the place for a child of God is to be right there where God can use him or her. When was the last time God fought through you? Can you look back and say, oh yeah, that was definitely God? You faced a challenge, you faced an obstacle, you thought it was all over, you knew you were doomed, but God came through. Do you remember God fighting through you? See, my friends, we have nothing to worry about when God fights for us, God fights ahead of us, and God fights through us. We know the victory is ours. In fact, we can have confidence when God fights our battles. Just make sure it's God fighting the battle. Just make sure it's not an ego trip that we're on and we decide to big up ourselves in a situation we should be humbling ourselves. Yes, we can have confidence when God fights our battles. So King Jehoshaphat learned as Israel was facing an invasion that he knew he could not withstand, but the word of God came and told him, get out there to the battle lines. And not only get out there, but set in the choir first. As they were going out to battle, the Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 20 that Jehaziel, just the Spirit of God got on Jehaziel and he spoke up. And he said to everyone there, listen, all you of Judah and you inhabitants of Jerusalem, and you, King Jehoshaphat, thus says Yahweh to you, do not be afraid nor dismayed because of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, it's God's. My friends, if our lives are in God's hands, then it's not our battle. If our will is in God's will, it's not our battle. If our commitment is to God's design, it's not our battle. We don't have to do it alone. Yes, victory comes from the struggle, but God will take the struggle for you. Victory comes with a battle, but God will fight the battle for you. Victory comes at a price, but God pays the price for you. So let God fight for you. Let God fight ahead of you. Let God fight through you. And if necessary, let God fight with you. Just let God win that fight. We have struggles. We all do. Sometimes things get worse before they get better. But if we hold on in faith, if we let God fight for us, if we let God lead the way, we will discover the things, the awesome things that God has in store for us. Would you let God fight for you today? Would you let him be the ruler? Would you let him be your commander? Would you let him have the victory Let God fight for you today.